If you're on Facebook, now you can follow Notebook on Cities and Culture on its official Facebook page. Take a look at facebook.com/Notebook on Cities and Culture. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. Gabriela, growing up here in Mexico City, when did you begin to realize there was a rich literary world here?
Well, I think that growing up, I grew up in Coyoacán, which is in the south part of the city, and it's sort of very rich culturally speaking. And it's also a place where, you know, Octavio Paz used to live and all these writers used to hang out at. And so I was always surrounded by books, and there was, now it's closed, sadly, there was a classic bookstore in the Zócalo, or the centro of Coyoacán. And so I would walk there when I was very small with my mother, or, you know, eventually when I was a teenager with my school friends, and we would, you know, sneak a cigarette and a coffee and look at the books. So, you know, and you realized that there were other people, older people there who were, you know, well-known writers such as Margot Glantz and many people lived in that neighborhood. This is another neighborhood where writers used to live or still live. And so it was very, you know, it was like, I don't know, growing up in a certain part of New York or growing up in a certain neighborhood and certain kinds of cities where you just realize there is that culture surrounding you, and you just live it in an everyday way. Right. You know, it's not something that's in a book on a bookshelf in your school library. It's just right there next to you, smoking and drinking a coffee, you know, and smelling weird if it's a, you know, old man or whatever. So that's how I felt more exposed to culture since an early age, I would say.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from Colonia, Condesa, here in Mexico City, sitting down with Gabriela Jauregui, poet, writer, author of pieces on many subjects, artistic and literary, for various publications, and the author of the poetry collection, Controlled Decay. Coyoacán now, it's known by visitors as the former home of Trotsky and Frida Kahlo. No, I mean, they think of it as a historical, artistic heritage, but it was also a literary place.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I mean, I used to, when I was very small, my, you know, sort of playground was Frida Kahlo's house because her patio, it was open to the public as it is now, but it was less of a structured museum back then. So I could just go and play in her patio and look at there's a beautiful fountain with ranitas in it, with frogs. The English is failing me. And so I would just play there. And it was, you know, it was really great to feel that was a part of just your playground, you know? And Trotsky's house was like the haunted house because it's such a creepy place.
Yes, still bullet holes in it.
Yeah. So we would go there and, you know, look at the ice pick and, you know, when we were older with my friends. And like I said, it was also where Octavio Paz lived, where Margot Glantz lives, etc. So all these places you would walk by, the house of El Indio Fernandez, who's a great filmmaker. You would just walk by them and you would know, or, you know, your parents would tell you or your neighbors would know. And so it was definitely a cultural place in the broadest sense, arts, visual arts and literary arts, etc.
Now, we're sitting here in your home surrounded by both English language and Spanish language literature, and I'm sure those are not the only two languages represented here. Did you grow up among the literature of various languages?
Well, not really. Yes and no. My mother and my grandmother are avid readers, and they loved reading and still love reading in English, mostly, even more so than Spanish, even though they're both Mexican. And so that's how I got exposed to the English language at an early age, and they would read me, fairy tales and nursery rhymes, etc., in English. At the same time as I'm living here, so of course I was also reading in Spanish and spoken to and speaking in Spanish, etc. And then I went to the French school. So the third language is French, and since kindergarten I got exposed to that. So then I have my collection of all the French classics and all the things we had to read in primary school and junior high school, etc., which are the staples of French kids, but were the staples of me at the same time as all these other things. So it was funny.
Were these ever, these three literatures in three languages, were these ever separate for you? Did you think of them as three different types of reading, or was it all just reading, all in languages you were exposed to all the time?
I would say it was all just reading, then, because I was constantly exposed to them, to all three. Also, in Mexico, as opposed to other countries like Spain, films and things like that aren't dubbed mostly. So even as a kid, just pop culture, you would listen to Michael Jackson and Madonna and, on the radio all the time. And you would go to Star Wars or, Little Orphan Annie or whatever, Mary Poppins, whatever the films you watch when you're a kid. And a lot of them weren't dubbed. And so you were exposed to English a lot.
So everybody gets it no matter what. Everybody gets English input. Whether or not they do anything with that is their choice.
Right. I mean, and of course, some people just listen to the radio and they don't speak it, and so they don't understand. But I think if you must have had this experience. Almost anyone and everyone at all levels of society knows a little bit of English because, it's the sort of cultural, the input that we're getting from Hollywood, from, like I said, even mainstream pop things are in English a lot. And so the radio, etc. And again, movies, etc. So even if they don't speak it, they speak some of it, or they know a couple of, words or funny replies or whatever.
Right. It's interesting to view the reactions when I go around town here, because I live in Los Angeles, so I do use Spanish every day in my regular life, and so I want to use it down here as well. And I do get the sense that some people kind of want to try speaking English to me, but don't, to look at me, know for sure that I speak it myself. I don't know what the tells are for who speaks English, but I guess I give off the vibe that I probably speak English, but might not. I don't know, but in the literary world here, tell me if this is true, since you're so connected to it. It seems fairly common for literary people, especially our age, to have gone to English language school from the beginning, or bilingual school, or to have an educational experience that was multilingual from the beginning. Do you think that's true?
Well, on the one hand, I want to say it's a class issue, because anyone who is middle class, let's say, probably went to a school that had some English or had, extracurricular English classes, as one would, painting or ballet or whatever. But then there are also many writers who are not from the, middle class and who have struggled perhaps to learn English, but think it necessary and think it part of their, cultural sort of expansion. But I would say, it depends. It's definitely from an early age and educationally, I think it's a class issue. Although now public schools, just, basic Mexican public schools, have Spanish, English language classes.
The very first time I came to Mexico City, I went book shopping almost immediately to, the branches of El Péndulo, say, or to the used bookstores on Donceles downtown. And it was such an exciting experience that I vowed never again to read a translation of a Spanish language work, to improve my reading skills by vowing only to read Spanish fiction in the original, or nonfiction. It's, I read it very slowly, but I'm getting the sense that now is a very exciting time in Spanish language literature. Do you think that's true?
I do. I think that there's, since a few years, and I think it started in Argentina while the economic crisis happened there, but it's spread out to the entire Latin America. I would say Latin American region. We'll see what happens with Spain now with their crisis, but I think it started there, and it spread this thing of having small presses and people taking risks and people deciding that they were tired of reading, bestsellers and paying a lot of money to read bestsellers, because I don't know if you look at books here, your average translation of a bestseller, or even, your average local writer who's a very commercial writer, those editions are quite expensive.
It can be like 250 pesos.
Yeah, which is a lot for people here.
I wouldn't pay it.
Neither would I, especially knowing, well, I mean, perhaps some of it is good, but, let's not be too snobbish. But, and so I feel like a lot of people were dissatisfied with what was there and with the diversity of things that were offered. It was very, a one kind of thing. And then if not, you had to go to Donceles to dig up amazing old, editions of things. So I think that a lot of people decided, well, let's just start our own press. And, from starting with things like cartonera presses, which is just photocopies and a piece of cardboard and that's it, to tons of independent presses, including Juan Carlos Cano, and it's not just him, it's a group of people who do Mangos de Hacha, or me and a group of friends started a press called Surplus, and there's another one called Tumbona that Vivian Abenchushan and another group of people, and it's funny because they're all sort of collectively run, and so all of us, we just, decided, wow, we can't find these kinds of books here, and we're all very different and focused on different things, and we all just decided, well, let's just do it, and take the leap. And of course it's not a business at all. It's not bestsellers and anything like that. But I think we're all surviving, which is interesting, and thriving. I think there are more and more independent presses. So yeah, I think it's a very exciting time to read in Spanish.
Tell me about, I was curious a little bit about the lack of what made you and your collaborators want to found Surplus.
For us specifically, we thought that there was a lack of affordable, well-designed books that were both aesthetically and politically, I wouldn't say radical, but experimental, let's say. So things, books that were engaged socially, but also aesthetically. So not just pamphlets and very, militant literature, which is great, but wasn't exactly what we were interested, and also not just literature for literature's sake, which is also fine and interesting, but that wasn't exactly what we were looking for either. We wanted a mix of both, and to be able to find it in nice, because you'll see also there's so very many books that are quite ugly, which is sad, because it's
everywhere. It's true.
Yeah. So we were also looking to publish something that was pretty or, attractive and nice to read, with good paper, with, design that would make holding the page agreeable, or etc. And also, where you wouldn't be spending more on a book than you would on 2 packs of beer or something.
Yes, indeed. That's an interesting comparison. I wonder, I don't know whether Surplus books are shrink-wrapped or not, but why are books shrink-wrapped here in Mexico?
Well, when we started off, because we just started, we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know we had to get ISBNs and, barcodes, etc. So of course we did. And we, had to learn and put stickers on because we hadn't printed it with the ISBN or whatever, things like that. And that included shrink wrapping. So our first books were not shrink wrapped. And after a while, we learned that it's actually very helpful to shrink wrap books here because of the distribution and transportation and dust and things like that. And I think people really like this idea of the pristine book that they get to open, like a present at Christmas or something. And if your books aren't shrink wrapped, they get dusty quickly. And then people, I feel like, shy away from them because they're just like, oh, maybe this has been opened. Is this really new? You know what I mean?
Right. Somebody could have read this before. How do I know?
Exactly.
Having read your collection, Controlled Decay, I'll ask this: do you consider poetry your own primary form?
I don't. I'm a traitor to the genres, I would say. Oh. Or a trans-genre person. I don't feel like a poet, with a P, with a capital P. I also don't feel like I'm just what here would be called a narrador, who only writes in prose and identifies as such, or, as one would identify as a journalist or things like that. Yes. I just write in whatever form the writing needs to take. So sometimes it's essays, sometimes it's short stories. I have a long novel hidden in a little corner. It's never ending. And then poetry when it needs to be poetry,
Do you write in whatever language you feel like you need to write in?
That's been an issue. It's a real question because when I moved to LA, I had to sort of learn English in the sense that I spoke it and I read it, but I couldn't really write it because I'd never really learned formal rules of grammar, etc. So I had these insane run-on sentences because I was translating in my head from Spanish, and Spanish.
Can you do that in Spanish? Run this. I have noticed this when I read Spanish novels. I do lose track of sentences sometimes, but are they longer?
Yes, they are definitely longer, and same thing in French. You just have these commas, and you can keep going. And in English, that's called a run-on sentence.
Right, we don't like that so much in English-speaking countries.
No. So I had this fantastic Shakespeare teacher who realized, okay, she's saying something interesting, but she just doesn't know how to say it. And she spent an entire semester with me in Los Angeles drinking white wine because I think she was probably wanted to shoot herself in the face, but helping me super generously to learn how to write out a proper sentence in English, because she was really encouraging for me to get my PhD, etc. And she said, you have to compete with English language native speakers who will know this inside and out because they've learned this since kindergarten. So let's work on this. And so, she would just be like, no, period, stop. And I was like, okay, period. And then she's like, okay, maybe a semicolon here, but really, period. So I learned this English way of writing. And so I started writing in English when I was there. And because out of necessity, let's say, because of school, and eventually out of pleasure. And I discovered the pleasure of writing in a language that isn't quite your own, because you find a certain freedom. You're less, or at least I felt less indebted to this mother tongue and this tradition. And
the whole heritage that stretches back.
Exactly. And of course, there's also heritage in English, but it felt less heavy on my shoulders somehow, and so it felt really liberating. So I started writing in English, and I finished that collection, and now I have another poetry collection, and I started my novel in English. And the reason it's taken forever, it's like I can't make up my mind in which language this needs to be written. And then once I moved back here, I just by osmosis almost, I felt like I needed to start in Spanish again. And then it's another whole new learning process because, again, I went to a French school, so Spanish isn't really the language that I super learned formally. And then I unlearned it because I focused on English. So then it's another, it's wow, it's like tangling and untangling knots, and then you're happy to have some of those knots, and then other knots are just, you get caught up in, and you need to really work through them.
Did this process of learning the finer points of English teach you anything about what the advantages of the English language are? I think native speakers of English don't often hold the language in a very high regard. It's sort of like, this is a very common language in the world, but maybe we think it's clunky or not improvised, but it grew in such a way that doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't know, what is your feeling on that?
I actually love that. And precisely sometimes, these weird exceptions and these non-rules.
Yes.
What I do love about it is that it is a pastiche there. I just said a French word,
Yes.
and then we have lots of Germanic words. And then there's some, Nordic, I don't know, coming from Swedish and things like that. And these kenning things where you can agglomerate words and invent words. I think it's a very... it's a language that keeps itself young more than other languages in general. I mean,
the French government tries not to keep their language young at any cost.
Yeah. And for instance, hyphenations, and you can just hyphenate, this long thing and it becomes this big word, and it's so much fun, at least for me. And it's also a language with a tremendous vocabulary for the same reasons. So because it's sort of, it's a pirate language in a way, it appropriates from all these other languages. And so it has many more words, let's say, than the Spanish language. And so that's very fun. And it's also very fun to feel free to create words, because you can. And
you not make up words in Spanish? Doesn't work so well?
You can do it, but it's less accepted, widely accepted than in English. In English you can just really do it and write a serious paper or an academic thing, and you might explain it, or you might put it in quotation marks or whatever, but you just go for it. And in Spanish, in an academic world, let's say, people would probably frown upon it, or you don't have hyphenated words at all. So it's at least to me, perhaps again because it's my older tongue, it feels slightly more rigid, and English felt much more fluid, and I felt I had the right to play with it.
How much does being involved in multiple languages for a long time make you interested in poetry? That sounds like an odd question, perhaps, but I would think that having so many examples of language gets you thinking instinctually about the mechanics of language, which makes you interested in poetry because it's so involved with how language works.
I think it's true. I think that because you have this distance somehow, all of a sudden, because you're involved in all these languages, but then at the same time, none of them actually feels 100% yours. You have this distance, and therefore you look at how funny or fun or bizarre or stiff, certain things about certain languages can be. And I think that poetry is it's perhaps the ideal way to explore that and play with that. And of course, in English, you have the poets called language poets who really focused on that. But you also have concrete poetry that plays with that. And, different or very sound-oriented poetry. And an example that I love is this poet, I believe he was Romanian. I hope I'm not mistaking I think he's Romanian. His name's Gerasim Luca, and he moved to France as a refugee, and that's when he started playing. He's a great poet, and played with the sounds of language in fantastic ways, because I think he was he heard things that native speakers don't hear anymore. Puns or funny things about language, and I think that happens sometimes with me, or hopefully I don't lose that. So never be too much of a master, so you can always be a sort of beginner who hears these things.
One language gives you perspective on the others, then.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, so you can step out of one and sort of into the next, jump from one swimming pool to the other, and therefore feel the variations in temperature, let's say.
You mentioned a bit earlier Juan Carlos Cano, the architect/poet, and I was talking with him earlier this week. I didn't even know he was a poet. I just talked to him for an hour, 2 hours as an architect, and now you reveal to me, he's also got a press, he's a poet. And we spoke earlier off mic about how it seems to me in Latin America, you never know who the poets are. Anybody could be one. It's always a surprise. In the United States, the poets project themselves as poets insistently. Here, it's more fluid. How correct is that? Is it correct at all?
Well, I guess I'm sure it depends on the poet. I mean, there are certain perhaps it's also a generation thing. I think there's perhaps some older poets who are very much poets and who recite poetry and who are, wonderful writers. I'm not saying their writing isn't wonderful, but who are very much capital P poets, and I think that because also now poetry, who reads poetry, sadly? It's not really métier or, something that you can live off of and practice professionally every day, and only that and only that, unless you're, very much a government-sponsored poet or something horrifying like that. So you have to do other things. So yes, Juan Carlos, maybe in a different life, would be just a poet. But he's actually an architect. And I think that brings all the more richness and makes his poetry all the better. People he collaborates with work as translators in film. And that's their day jobs. And then they're poets as well. There are poets who do all kinds of different activities. Obviously, there's the more traditional, university professors kind of thing. But I know another poet who's a TV writer. Different things, scientists, etc. So, yeah, you don't necessarily know who a poet is. Poets here wear other costumes or other hats, yeah.
Now, you were born and raised in Mexico, but you mentioned that you studied in California. What made you decide to go north to study?
It was a fate, chance thing. Initially I had gone to New York, but my then partner got a grant to go to California. So I just, decided, great. Let's do that. And I didn't know anything about Los Angeles. I had only been once, when I was a child with my parents and went to Disneyland.
Yeah, that's even in Orange County. So it's like you didn't even get there.
No, exactly. So I think we stayed in LA and drove down there. And that was, I remember Santa Monica and like some, Malibu and driving around the coast or whatever. And then driving up north with my family. But that was it. I had no clue. So when I got there, I was quite surprised. It was sprawling, and in a way, it's very much like Mexico City. But at first, I didn't expect it to be. And I feel like LA is a city that reveals its charms and secrets slowly. It's not like New York, where everything's right there, and you just walk one block and you know exactly where the restaurant is, where your friends hang out and have drinks, the bar that you need to be at or whatever. Right. It's all right there. LA, you have to drive around, and it turns out the most fantastic restaurant is in this horrifying strip mall that you would have never driven into because it's so ugly. And then, you go in there and it's a hole in the wall, and you discover the most, delicious dishes you've ever tried. And then, so it's that sort of city. And so at first it was hard, and then I just found, its secret, and it's sort of unlocked that part of it. And I adore it, and I miss it every day.
Los Angeles does require you to master it in some sense, and that's what I like about it. It's what fascinates me, is it does pose a challenge to you to figure it out. And I am still holding out. I haven't broken down and bought a car yet, but I feel that if I can not have one, I've somehow transcended. I've reached a certain level of Los Angeles mastery. I don't know. Maybe I just don't want to spend the money. But Mexico City, do you think Mexico City? Where does it fall on that spectrum of Los Angeles is hard to get to know, New York, you already know where you have to go, and you can just kind of walk around and find a place? Where is Mexico City on that spectrum? I feel like I can just drop myself down here, but then I feel like I can't, or shouldn't.
I think it's sort of, it oscillates a little bit between the two. I think that it depends on the neighborhood. So some neighborhoods are more that sort of New York vibe, for lack of a better way to describe it, where you just know, oh, here's 5 different cafes, 10 different restaurants, 8 different bars, and just by looking at them, you know which one you would want to be at and which one you wouldn't want to be at, and you just go there and have a drink and whatever. But then it's a humongous city, again, like LA, so you really need if you want to explore other places than, the 5 neighborhoods that are sort of here surrounding downtown, let's say, and the Chapultepec area, if you really want to look at those neighborhoods, you really need to be enthusiastic, patient. You hopefully know someone there who lives there who might recommend things, or, you have a reason to go there, etc. So it's more, in that sense, it becomes more like LA. If you didn't know that there are X, Y, and Z restaurants in Monterey Park, why would you go to Monterey Park?
Yes, true.
Or, etc. So you just have a reason to go there, and then you go there, or you have friends who live there and then you go there, or family or whatever. So there's that side of this place too. And like LA, Mexico is a place where also people like to hang out at their houses or apartments, or, in their neighborhoods. So it's not just about going out and eating out and staying out, etc. It's also about indoors and what happens behind, the facades of places, which is a very LA thing. You're in your backyard and you're having a barbecue and you invite people over. It's not always about going out to restaurants. New York is much more that, because space is so much more limited, I think, and time. So I think there's both things going on.
And having grown up in Coyoacán and Mexico City, and this area, you lived through some of the decades that people look back and say, oh, those were the bad times in Mexico City, the 80s and 90s. How does that feel, having the whole time of your childhood and adolescence being called the bad years of Mexico City? Were they so bad?
I don't feel like they were so bad. I mean, the 80s, just historically speaking and politically speaking, it was still very much closed. There was no or very little contact with the outside. But like I said, we still had, Star Wars and
Yes.
and Little Orphan Annie or whatever. But there weren't, I remember these things like there were no M&Ms. Or things, there were no American candies. They were all Mexican candies. M&Ms were called lunetas, and they were the same colors and just a slightly different taste, of course. So it was all like, locally made things that at that time we all sort of shunned. And, whoever went to the States, if someone was going to Houston or wherever, you would just beg that they bring you, a box of Nerds or a pack of M&Ms, and that was a super fancy gift.
Please, some Nerds and M&Ms. There's a word for that idea, that the notion in Mexico that whatever is Mexican is by definition inferior, isn't there?
Yeah, it's called Malinchismo.
That's right.
And it comes from the Malinche, who was, Cortez's wife, and who helped, let's say, the colony, who helped the conquest of Mexico. But it's not necessarily, her figure is much more complicated than that, actually. But the word comes from that sort of folk version of her figure. She was also a translator. Anyway, so yeah, there was very much that in the 80s. And then I feel like the 90s were a really interesting period. Politically, again, it was turmoil. I mean, there was the Zapatista uplifting. There were horrifying killings where towns were getting wiped out by the government, etc. And we were starting to hear about this, because I think that happened in the 70s and 80s all the time, but people didn't hear about it because the state controlled, the 3 TV channels, that was it, and, et cetera, et cetera. And in the 90s, things started to open up, and therefore, journalists started to, video camera, all the things that we know before internet even, but then with internet. So all of a sudden, people taped these things, and, it was like the Rodney King, but here, and suddenly people heard what was going on. It was horrifying. At the same time, this opening was also letting people like Kurt come and open up places, and little artist-run spaces popped up. And so all of a sudden I felt like the city was thriving. I remember being, a teenager and going to see this show of contemporary Mexican artists at the Museum of Modern Art. And it's all artists who are well known now. They're in their early 40s. but so they were a generation ahead of me. And I remember looking at this and being like, wow, this is super cool. There's this happening here. Yeah. So, and identifying with it and realizing that their references were the same, ironic jokes to those 80s things or whatever. And so it was a transition period with all the positive and negative, but I don't really look at it as the dark years. I think probably the 70s and 80s slightly more, but the 90s I think were very interesting times.
And this Kurt you've mentioned is Kurt Hollander, the author of a recent autobiography, Several Ways to Die in Mexico City, and he's a photographer and a filmmaker. And he told me when I talked to him earlier, I grew up in New York City in the 1970s. Mexico City was never going to scare me at all, and despite there's a lot of it still has a falsely scary reputation in the United States. Mexico City does, but I want to know what you think the literature coming out of Mexico City or Mexico has reflected about this. When I was speaking with Diego Rabasa of Sexto Piso Press, he said a lot about his frustrations with the politics of Mexico and how he sees them. He sees that frustration reflected in what writers are saying now and what they can say. And I wonder if this is an unprecedented time for that.
Well, I don't think it's unprecedented. I wouldn't dare say that because I immediately thought of someone like Ibargüengoitia. I don't know if you've read him, Jorge Ibargüengoitia. He wrote scathing, hilarious satires of what was going on in Mexico, in the 50s and 60s. And so, it's something that still that's still very much a preoccupation of writers now, but I wouldn't say exclusively. But I think that there is a generation of very sort of, not disenchanted, but almost, sometimes nihilistic almost, writers who are just like from very urban and very dark, let's say. And so there is that. And very funny in very, ironic ways. So, but I think that's probably always existed as a part of, the culture, the counterculture of the city.
And tell me if I'm right or wrong about this, but it seems like writers have never been suppressed here in their criticism to the extent that, say, the Soviet Union would suppress their critics. People have, to some extent, been able to criticize the regime here. Even I'm sure not everybody went unpunished, but has it been more possible here?
Well, I'll speak of today because I think that the 70s were a very, I think, hard decade here, and there was very much, there were very intense and subtle, elegant ways of repressing people, and that's why they're referred to as the dirty wars, because everything was sort of underground. They would disappear people, etc. But not like in Argentina, not like in Chile, not like in the Soviet Union, to speak of two opposite, not like in Cuba. But still, there was very much a sort of cloaked, veiled repression. Nowadays, I think, it's more to do with the market. Like, if you publish certain kinds of things or you write certain kinds of things, it'll be very hard for you to get published. But, and on a hopeful note, I think presses like Sexto Piso, all of us independent presses, from bigger ones like Sexto Piso to smaller ones like Surplus, Mangos de Hacha, Tumbona, etc. I think that's one of our reasons to exist, is to publish precisely those kinds of things, very openly critical and of the status quo, whatever that might be, not just politically speaking, I mean aesthetically, etc.
I do get the sense, and as I said, I read Spanish very slowly and can only read so much Mexican literature as a result, but I get the sense that writers today, some of them express a kind of frustration that they see vast potential in Mexico, but see it quashed in a million ways. Do you get that sense?
I feel less quashed because I see the potential and I feel less frustrated, perhaps because I lived abroad for so long. I mean, so many people sometimes fantasize. Again, it's Sometimes it's Malinchismo, and sometimes it's just the grass is greener on the other side, you know? So many people are like, oh, look at the potholes in the city, god damn it, or, you know, or, the metro is so dirty, or whatever, you know?
It's pretty clean compared to New York City. You've been there.
It smells like pee everywhere. It doesn't smell like pee here.
The design is kind of cool, retro now in Mexico City.
Retro orange. So... you know, but those kinds of things maybe become very grating if you haven't had the chance or the perspective to leave and experience somewhere else, except on vacation, perhaps. And vacations are always fantastic, and you don't really notice that, you know, the subway in New York smells like pee because you're in New York and it's exciting. Or that, you know, whatever, in LA, cops will pull you over and will be just as corrupt as a cop here sometimes, etc. You know, so... sometimes I feel like people here have a tendency to focus on that negative aspect while forgetting that negative aspects such as those or others exist in every city. And I think that it does have a very big potential. And I think the fact that you're here interviewing people and that you have been here and want to come back reveals that. And not just you, that there are artists from Berlin, from Belgium, from France, from, you know, ex-New Yorkers, ex-LA people from like Daniel and Kurt, etc., who have moved here. And more, this is one thing I have noticed, more and more foreigners, you know, riding bikes, and who are finding ways to live here or live here for extended periods of time. I have many friends who do that. So to me, that reveals that there's something here that people are noticing, and that potential is sort of coming to a boiling point. And perhaps locals are more exasperated, but I feel like the fact that this is happening is, you know, points to something interesting without so much negative aspects. Yeah, so many negative aspects.
What did first traveling outside of Mexico teach you about Mexico when you first got to spend real time outside Mexico? What did you learn about Mexico by being away?
How much you actually love it. I mean, I think probably if you had spoken to me prior to my living abroad, I would have probably also complained about the goddamn potholes and and oh my god, and look, this day is just so dusty and polluted, and this other day is just this and that, and, you know, oh, I went to the market and I couldn't find this and whatever. And where's my, you know, Italian, you know, orzo pasta, blah, blah, blah. I could find that in New York anywhere. You know what I mean? The kinds of,
where's my orzo?
Oh, good grief, you know, come on. And then all of a sudden you go abroad and you realize, there's all these great things I really do miss and I really appreciate about the city, and certain kinds of freedoms, and, you know, the fact that neighbors, let's say, and, you know, here we are in many apartments and they're old and you can hear everyone, you know, basic things like if they want to throw a party, good for them. And I know I'm never going to call the cops because one day I'm going to throw a party. Right. I mean, this is
There's a social agreement, though, that nobody's going to call the cops.
Exactly. And, you know, that would never happen in Europe. It's like you get the cops called on you immediately at, you know, 11 p.m. Forget it. And even in, you know, in other places like the States, too. So just silly little things of daily life like that that actually do make a difference. Or, you know, and there is a social contract here, despite the immensity, despite what seems sometimes like a rough city, where, you know, people actually help out and people actually look out, and that doesn't necessarily happen in other cities abroad. And I think, I mean, it's a cliche to speak of the warmth of Mexican people. You know, it's horrifying, but there is that too, and sometimes you miss that. I mean, now I spend a lot of time in Paris, and that's something that I was completely shocked by. Even though I speak the language perfectly, blah, 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 all of a sudden I was encountered this, you know, very cold, mind your own business, don't look, you know, don't look too much into other people's eyes, don't smile too much, God forbid they talk to you and they're insane, you know, that kind of thing. Or
but they're that way to each other too. Absolutely. So it's like, well, it's even stranger in a way when you see they're they're kind of ignoring one another, not just you because you're foreign.
No, absolutely. It has nothing to do. They wouldn't even necessarily know that I'm a foreigner, and it's still very much a very closed off thing, which is quite shocking. And some people like that comfort. It makes them comfortable to know that they'll be left alone and they're not bothering anyone either. But coming from here, I actually appreciate the fact that someone might help you cross the street if you have, too many supermarket bags or whatever.
Right. I was looking at your bookshelves and I noticed reading Los Angeles, the anthology put together by David Hewlin, who's a friend, and I've had him on the show 3 times, I think. And that is a valuable book for placing yourself in Los Angeles mentally before going there. But what did you read personally? Did you read books to do with Los Angeles before you went to spend time there and study there? Did you have any sense of literarily getting your mind ready for the city?
No, it was a total, like I said, it was so much just fate and sort of a leap of love and faith where you're just like, all right, let's go wherever, whatever. I don't even know what LA is like. And perhaps that's why I also had kind of a shock. But the first thing I did read was City of Quartz by Mike Davis.
And it wouldn't get you too excited about the city, but it's informative.
Yeah, you just think, oh, good grief. Yes, everywhere. It's just corrupt everywhere. It's like Mexico. Precisely one of those things. But it was super interesting. And actually, this LA reader I read in a class with Mike Davis. Oh. So who knew when I was arriving? I would have never known. But it would have been, if you would have told me that when I arrived and was reading City of Quartz, oh, you're going to be with Mike writing in class. And, I would have never believed you, but there, it happened. And so he was my one of my favorite professors, and he suggested we read this and get the sense of place. And all of our writing exercises and things for that class were digging into the sense of place in LA, in your neighborhood or whatever. And so the perfect example was this anthology. And it really made me feel like I adopted the city, and it really made me excited about living there. And I wish there were more readers like that for Mexico City, actually.
Which brings me to another question is, what should... I try to read as much as I can about Mexico City because I know I'll always be coming back. I need to learn more. What would you recommend? I mean, and not just what's the best or what's the one thing, but anything that listeners who want to get a sense of place of Mexico City, whether they read Spanish or don't, or whether they want fiction or nonfiction, anything, even if it's not directly related to Mexico City, what can get their minds ready for a city like this?
Well, I think there are several things I would recommend. Of course, one big one, which I think now is almost, you probably want to hit me with a broom for saying this, but it's Roberto Bolaño, of course.
Sure. People have been saying it, yes.
Yeah, Savage Detectives. He wasn't a Mexican writer, but became one because...
Is he considered... The Mexican readers have adopted his works, essentially? He's... essentially Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, that book is very Mexico City. He captured, perhaps like only a foreigner could, I don't know, because you're inside and outside. He captured the essence, the different ways of speaking for different neighborhoods, the neighborhoods themselves, just a vibe, really, of a place. And he did it so well. I think that's part of the book's charm and part of why it became so, popular and why everyone loves to talk about it. But really, it's a good introduction to Mexico City to get a feel. Of course, it's written in the it's happening, it's not written, but happening in the 70s, etc. So it's not exactly today's Mexico City, but it's so very much today Mexico City still. So there's that. But I would also recommend reading... There's this really wonderful book called Visión de los Vencidos. I don't remember. It's translated into English. And it's the last sort of writings of the Aztecs as they were being defeated by the Spaniards. And you get a sense of the city back then, Tenochtitlan. And you still get that by flashes here and there now in Mexico. The sense of these teeming markets and this activity, and then you go downtown, and of course there's a chunk of pyramid right there, and
or in the subway stations, the bits and pieces of the Aztec society right there, and you're making your connection from line 1 to 4 or whatever, and so that's a big Aztec there, a Mayan thing,
Yeah, and it's the Aztec, definitely. Yeah, it's a giant. It was I think for the god of. Shoot, I forget, but it's almost like, now it's a fountain, but it's a big old carved piece.
Is that the one in Pino Suarez? Oh yeah.
So, there is. I would recommend that so that you feel these layers. I think it's a very layered city. So I would read something like Bolaño in tandem with something from that period, which would make a lot of sense. And I know there's a I have it here, Mexico City Reader. I believe it might be Rubén Gallo who co-edited it. And there's lots of small essays. And there's always someone like Carlos Monsiváis, who was such a chilango, loved everything about the city, walked everywhere, of course, lived downtown, and just wrote about the city constantly. I think he is probably the biggest lover of this city in recent times.
He's very much a chronicler, especially of the 85 earthquake and its aftermath, right? He's sort of defined what the city was after that, the nature of the civil society here.
Yeah, and he also so he had many levels of writing. Some of it was very political and social. Other times it's just lyrical almost, and it's just these odes to a city he loved and lived well, or to cantinas, etc. And then there's people like David, of course, David Lida, and or Guillermo Fadanelli, just these urban, more writers who are writing fiction, not necessarily nonfiction, but who give you a sense of the city as well. But I would also look at Jodorowsky's films.
Oh yes, I would watch them for any reason. But yes, as well. You consider him to be a captor of something about the nature of this place?
Yeah. Another, like Bolaño, another Chilean exile living here, adopted somehow, by us, I would say. And he does capture some of this crazy energy that lives in the city. Again, I don't want to sound like the big cliche of this, like Artaud when he came here, or Breton, who were like, oh, Mexico City is like living surrealism, good grief, okay, thank you.
It's not that weird, is it?
Come on. It's just, that's how we live, or this sense of like, oh, magical Mexico that, foreigners also cultivate, which can be, on the limit of exoticism, or,
I think you have to come from farther away than Los Angeles to think of magical Mexico.
Absolutely. LA is magical Mexico. I mean, it's an extension of...
So I do think of it as an extension of Mexico. Definitely. It's kind of one of the reasons I'm there, because it's, the food makes the food better.
Yeah, definitely. Jodorowsky captures that spirit of nonsense and absurdity, but also a very, intense, some kind of intensity that happens in the city. And so many, his films are shot in many locations around the city. Not El Topo, of course, which happens in the desert, but La Montaña Sagrada, the Holy Mountain, and Santa Sangre, which in English is what? Holy Blood? I don't know.
They just call it Santa Sangre.
Okay. So those two are very much about Mexico City, I feel like. So if you feel lazy about reading a fat Bolaño book, then just, enjoy Jodorowsky, a Jodorowsky movie.
I still regret that he never made the planned film he was going to make starring, I think, Nick Nolte and Marilyn Manson, that ran out of money or something. The guy has had a lot of ideas, and I'm sure he's not done. I hope he's not done.
No, there's a I don't know if I'm even supposed to, if this is like secret or not, but there's a foundation here that's giving him money for his new film. And whether that film is exactly the one with Marilyn Manson, who is going to somehow play I can't even remember. I saw the storyboard for that. At some point, there's like this giant head of Jesus that comes out of the desert and has laser beam eyes and like exterminates people. Anyway, so
sounds about right.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's that one, and that was the one with Marilyn Manson, I believe, or if it's a different film that he just decided to strip the other one. But in any case, he's making a new film, and people here are funding it. So,
now, you mentioned getting the feel of the pre-Hispanic life when you're walking around Mexico City in the markets. But I was yesterday I've been, of course, to Teotihuacan before, but yesterday I went to, and this is a word that's hard for gringos to say, Ciudad Universitaria, the area, the larger area around the UNAM campus. I was looking at the museum there, and we mentioned Juan Carlos Cano. He said to me, make sure you think about the sense of space there and the way that Ciudad Universitaria relates to the space around it, because it's exactly the same way as Teotihuacan does. And I thought, this wasn't built by the Aztecs, but it's, you get these, I mean, the word that often comes up is a palimpsest. You get these layers of history here. Do you feel more of that personally in Mexico City than in other cities, where you can read these very distinct eras expressing themselves in all kinds of ways, no matter when the environment around you was built?
I think yes, because of course, if you go to Athens or Rome, you have these ruins right there, and you're, driving around them in in your little Vespa or in a crazy cab or whatever, who's like screaming at the top of his lungs, and you're looking at, these columns and very, and so you get that sense of history and it's very present, but it feels, at least maybe it's because I'm from here, I don't know, but it feels much more alive here. There seems to be a continuum. The Greece, okay, that civilization is done, and those that you don't even speak that language, that Greek in Greece today.
It's completely cut off.
Yeah, and Romans today with their cell phones, it's hard to imagine how they could be wearing a toga and at the Parthenon, sorry, not at the Parthenon, at in the circus or whatever. So there's something here where the language, even though we're speaking Spanish and not Nahuatl, Spanish that we speak is full of Nahuatl words. There's a sense that these places have been, like the Basilica of the Guadalupe Virgin, that was a holy site for the Nahua culture. That the fact that the cathedral downtown is right next to the pyramid, because it was holy ground back then, and that was the way to sort of incorporate it and convert people into Catholicism. So there is this thing, of course, due to colonialism, but also in spite of it, that survives, and that sort of got integrated into contemporary Mexico. The food that we eat is still, there's lots of it that's very, very Aztec.
Right, that's my favorite, huitlacoche, right? That goes back.
Yeah, absolutely. And nopales, and I mean, not to mention, of course, tortillas, etc. But even sweets like amaranth, those amaranth and honey. Turns out, I found out for a while they were forbidden because the Spaniards didn't want them to confuse it with the Holy Host. Because they were made, a lot of offerings to the gods were made with amaranth and honey, and sometimes even blood. You would prick yourself and put a little bit of your blood in there. So it's very similar in a weird way to, the Holy Host and the blood of Christ or whatever. So they were like, no, you cannot cultivate or eat amaranth, etc. It became like this taboo thing. And then it never really stopped, of course. And today you can go anywhere on any street corner and eat these amaranth sweets that are delicious and healthy. But, so all of this is very present, even though sometimes you don't even realize that you're just living it every day, which is, again, why it's very much alive. It's not like a dead culture that disappeared and a new culture that emerged. It's a little bit of both.
It seems like it must be a uniquely stimulating place for writing, then. Tell me if that's true.
I mean, I find it to be, but in a different way, I also found LA to be a very stimulating place because it has so many cultures and so many things happening as well. But yeah, this layered, very particular historical layering, I think is fascinating, and it makes it's very daunting, because how do you incorporate that into your writing? How do you stay away from it, or do you, etc.? But it's also extremely stimulating. Yeah.
I've been speaking here in Colonia Condesa with writer, poet. Did you call yourself a traitor to genre? Was it traitor to genre? Gabriela Jauregui. Muchísimas gracias, Gabriela.
Gracias a ti.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munvirzi, Rob Motz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Millman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.